Were no creeps actually harmed in this? I'm not so sure, but with how much I enjoy a good tower defense, when a key for this popped into my inbox, you had to know I was going to take it for a spin. And while No Creeps TD actually does a lot of things I like and is a decent enough tower defense for scratching the itch, there are a few nitpicks I have as well. Though before we dive too deep into that, you're probably wondering where it fits in the genre, since there are a lot of approaches to it. And it's mostly your traditional maze-focused tower defense, though it does pack in some not quite roguelite aspects, but more persistent and randomized buffs based on your performance mixed with experience-based unlocks. And it is also a bit more open to letting you play the levels in whatever order you want, since you unlock the new ones in batches, but always have several to choose from, while the story progresses in the same manner regardless of whether you start at the top of the list or a couple maps down. And speaking of the story, you can engage with it however you want, even so far as turning it off in the options menu. Though if you do watch it, it basically explains the confusion and malcontent of your main character, a Brian in a jar. And yes, I said that right, though it is also a brain and eyeballs in it too. The voice acting is done by the developer and has a tongue-in-cheek, low-budget feel to it that almost works for me, though it does come across as trying a bit too hard in the sarcastic or over-the-top tones. Basically think low-budget Earthworm Jim vibes.
So, I'd like to know more about this resource I'm collecting. What is it exactly? You see, I'm graded based on how much of the stuff I'm collecting, but my score only seems to go up when I kill creeps.
Glade Corp is the primary supplier for lubricant used in self-sealing flux regulators, endothermic incubators, and retractable error.
About that, what's with all these weird artifacts we're collecting? Where did they come from? How is this knotted mass of wires and flesh making my bullets more lethal? These things seem to defy science.
ERROR.
And the majority of your time and energy will be spent in the levels regardless, and starting out, they're pretty straightforward with what you'd normally expect. Place down towers, make enemies weave their way through them, get a good mix of area of effect, movement control, and just straight heavy damage. Though you do also want to keep in mind that this game's towers can be a bit, well, quirky, since in addition to each tower imposing a tax on income, it also uses a line of sight system that appears to be based on the turret's models. So if you pop up a tower on a wall, it won't be able to shoot things right next to that wall because it can't see them, and you'll have to keep an eye out for if it can see past neighboring turrets as well, even if they're on the low ground. This is fairly clearly communicated for the turret being placed, though you can sometimes block old turrets without realizing it, and things can get a bit fiddly with this system when you're trying to make more complex mazes. The real catch with it though is that the game allows your towers to be damaged, which is fine in the right context with the right balance, though I don't think they quite implement it super effectively here. This is mostly because I think the damage output of the enemies is way overtuned for what it is, especially in later levels where even with maxed out health upgrades on a given tower, it would often be gone before even a quarter of the way through the wave. This is made more conspicuous by the much more restrictive mazing opportunities this game has than a number of its competitors. Namely because the maps eventually start looking more like Hot Wheels tracks rather than tower defense platforms, with a few actively having warnings that they are limited in mazing opportunities. So you need to focus heavily on DPS sources on those types of maps. But if those towers crumble like paper, it becomes a lot more frustrating rather than difficult. Though on the plus side, if you are mazing, they do still at least keep enemies from walking through them even when destroyed, so your maze stays intact, even if the world is crumbling around you. And you can heal the building with an ability mid-wave, but it's extremely limited as to how often you can do it, even with the currency building to boost the recovery rate of the energy. Now, you won't encounter any of that for the first few hours of play, since these types of offensive critters only start showing up on the medium difficulty maps during normal play, or during the endless mode of easier levels, with most of the rest of the enemies just being runners that don't attack your stuff. That said, these attackers do add to the layers of variety on enemies, since with the runners you have the regular movement units as well as units that get tankier over time by being shot, and even units that teleport in straight lines or change their speed each time they're hit. And on the attack units, you have everything from laser shooting balls to fast shooting swarms, and probably the most annoying of the bunch, an artillery launching unit that does massive AoE damage. And after 4 hours of trying out the game, that last one has resulted in more rage quits than any other unit, especially since once they show up, they just never seem to stop. Now, ignoring how frustrating it is to have your turrets flattened by these guys even through max health upgrades and heals, the turrets themselves are actually fine otherwise, with most of the standards you'd expect from a good tower defense game, with straight firing cannons, shotguns, artillery, slow traps, tracking lasers, Tesla towers, flamethrowers, and even a resource booster building, among other things. So you will not be lacking in options. Though you will need to consider placement to a decent extent, since while most of them are single square buildings and even able to be placed on walls if you for some reason wanted to do that with the line of sight issues, there is the reality that a lot of your more useful buildings are not these single square ones, with long range options like artillery and the cloning pool being 4 squares in a perfect square, and the resource booster being an odd Tetris piece that will explode if damaged enough, and it will wipe out all of your buildings with it. Now, how all of this is affected by the experience system and the item system is fairly minor. The experience system just levels you up so you can unlock new towers and such, while the item system appears to be a method of getting various minor perks or tower tweaks by picking which 3 of the frankly ever-growing pile of items you find, which at first will mostly be a mishmash of random +% buffs and a low % chance to trigger an effect. Though as you get more, you can focus them much more towards an objective, such as boosting 1 or 2 specific towers and enabling their special abilities to trigger more often. And with this focus, you'll last longer on maps, period. And this will in turn get you better quality booster equipment. Where it caps though, I'm not entirely sure, since I've only gotten so far into the endless mode to get uncommon level drops. In terms of creature comforts you'd expect in a tower defense title, it has most of what you'd expect, but not all. Namely, it has Wave Rush, a time booster, though only a fairly mild one, and tower upgrades, though they are admittedly very granular, so you'll be choosing between life, damage, attack speed, range, etc. until you really boost up your income per turn and can explore the more expensive, higher level investments. And it also sadly lacks a bit in terms of hotkeys, especially for some of the core functions, like the Wave Rush. At least when I tried it, the only way I could find to make the Wave Rush happen was by clicking it with the mouse. Though you thankfully can pause and unpause with the space button, and some of the navigation controls will feel a bit weird at first. And even after so many hours, I'll be moving the camera with WASD, and then press E expecting to rotate, like most games, when it actually raises the camera, with C lowering it. Most of the actual camera rotation functions are sadly mouse bound. And as you get to the later levels, you will need this mouse rotation, since some of the levels get pretty bendy. Even one shaped like a 6-sided dice that is almost mandatory to do with rotation of the camera. But all that together, both the cool quirks, the Wish.com Earthworm Jim style storywork, and even some of the things I've been left feeling negative about still amount to a fairly fun tower defense game that does try to stand on its own rather than just being another cookie-cutter tower defense. Does it still have a ways to go? Yes, but it's got the groundwork. Now it just needs to survive and get attention long enough in early access to hopefully build on that. And if you want to see more first looks, reviews, and game guides ad-free, check out the Patreon where there's plenty of ad-free videos available for both patrons as well as public viewers.